Good evening. I'm going to make sure that you can hear me before I say anything important after our last couple times of technical difficulties. I want to make sure we're okay. Oh, great. Thank you. I'm so glad you can hear me and see me. It's Vampire Book Club. Welcome. How many people do we have here tonight? Ah, nice. Right, what am I drinking tonight before we begin? This is Captain Peanut Butters. It is from a local brewery, Charlotte, North Carolina, which is where I live. It is an imperial porter brewed with cocoa nibs and peanut butter. It's called Chocolate Revenge. And it is 9.2% ABV, and it comes in a 16-ounce can. Those are all things I love. Not really themed to this month's book. There weren't really much drinking in this month's book. Just a lot of smoking and pot smoking. But we're not going to do that on Vampire Book Club. We drink alcohol. That is our vice of choice. Look at that. Peanut butter beer. I've had this before. It's chocolatey and delicious, and it's amazing. Oh, it's your first time at the book club stream? Welcome. This is the Vampire Book Club, where we read one book a month that has something to do with vampires, because as you can see behind me, I have a giant shelf full of vampire books. That is actually just one shelf of many that I have, and we need to read them all, and it helps me read my books when you read them with me. So everybody who's in the book club who reads with me, I appreciate you joining me. If you don't read with me, that's okay. I am just happy to have you here to talk about vampire books and other vampire things. Anything that's vampires, we can talk about after we finish talking about the book. I know you always have lots of questions for me that are not book related. Save them for later. If while I'm talking the book you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat or save them for later. I usually scroll up in the chat, but sometimes I miss things, so you can always ask twice. Cheers. Your heart dances like Louise and Jonah's. This is very foamy. Blot my lips. It's really good. A lot of head on this chocolate peanut butter beer. It really just tastes like chocolate and peanut butter. So, this month I chose the book for book club. Often I'll let the book club vote between 3 books or more. But this month I was traveling last November 13th. And we usually choose the book by the 13th because club goes from the 13th to the 13th every month. And I was traveling, so I couldn't really take a picture of 3 books and have people vote on them. So I just picked a book that I've been wanting to read for a very long time. And now we have finally read it together. It is The Moth Diaries by Rachel Klein, it came out in 2002, but it was made into a movie in 2011, which I reviewed on this channel in one of my early vampire vlog style reviews where I kind of speak unscripted like this and talk about the movie that I just saw. So it wasn't a thorough review of the movie. It was just kind of my impressions and feelings after having just watched the movie. And from what I remember about the movie, I liked a lot of it. I thought it was a well done movie. I liked the concept of the story. Now having read the book, I realized most of what I liked about the movie was straight from the book, and the parts I didn't like about the movie were things that the movie did differently. But it was a very pretty movie, and it has one of my favorite actors in it, Lily Cole, so I was very happy to see it. And I'd always wanted to read the book it was based on. And I had sort of thought this book was just like your run-of-the-mill YA post-Twilight boom vampire teenager book, which I was wrong. It actually came out before the vampire craze of the 2000s. And the author who wrote it, it was her first book and her only book. She hasn't put out any other books since. She's a professional writer and editor and translator, but this is her only novel. It came out in 2002, but it's set in 1970/71. And it's diaries. It is all in the form of diary entries from one person who is nameless. The movie named her Rebecca, which was an homage to the gothic novel Rebecca. But in the book, she has no name. She just talks in first person in her diary entries. But the beginning of the book has a foreword from her, a preface, where she explains that her psychiatrist encouraged her to publish this diary 30 years after she wrote it. So she's writing this book in 2000, and then it came out obviously 2 years later. It takes a while for books to get published. So 30 years earlier is 1970, and I actually checked the dates because it's diary entry. It has dates and then it says what day of the week is. So I went back and I looked at a 1970 calendar, and it does line up with those dates. So it is set in the school year of 1970 to 1971. And she is a 16-year-old girl. She's a junior in high school, but she doesn't go to regular high school. She goes to a very exclusive, very spooky, creepy, gothic boarding school, which has boarding students, all girls boarding school. It has students that live there as well as students that just come for the day classes. And she is one of the students who lives there. And it's a very small group of girls in her dormitory called the residents that are the characters in the story. The girls that she's been at school with for a while, who live on her same floor, and she interacts with basically her housemates. And the style of it is not the YA style. A lot of people call this book YA, but it came out before YA was the style, the cliche, the like genre it practically became after like 2005. So this is written in a more ambiguous style. Yes, it's about teenagers, and teenagers could read it, but I don't feel like it was written for teenagers, which is what actually defines YA. I feel like this book was just written as a book that she had in her soul to write. So yes, people call it YA, but it wasn't published as YA because that didn't really exist in the mainstream way that it does now. So the preface of the book says that she's encouraged by her psychiatrist to publish this book 30 years later, change all the names, make it so no one can identify anything about it. And she says she has reservations about publishing it, but her psychiatrist thinks that it speaks to universal truths of, adolescence, and he thinks this would be valuable to be published. So she agrees to have it published, and then at the end of it, she puts an afterword of like what happened to her in the 30 years since this book. Atmospheric horror is a good name for the genre. Gothic is really the genre. This is a gothic novel in the style of Rebecca or Wuthering Heights or Jane Eyre, but modern, a very modern gothic novel written in 2002, set in 1970. So we are in an era of cell phones, internet. So this is very secluded, remote feel to it, where the girls are all living together in their dormitory. So it starts off with the main character. I'll probably call her Rebecca just for simplicity's sake. She is just coming back to school for her junior year. She started at this school when she was a freshman, but she started halfway through the year. And the reason she ended up at this weird fancy school is because it's where her mother had gone. And her father dies. Her father commits suicide when she is 14 years old. And he devastates their family. She and her mother are just both wrecked by his suicide. And she's close to her mother. She really loves her mother, but they just can't live together. They can't be together. So her mother sends her off to boarding school so that they can kind of grieve separately. And she says she had trouble when she started school her freshman year. Halfway through the year, everyone thought she was like, oh, the girl with the dead father who committed suicide. She was kind of an outcast feeling, but she eventually got very close with people there, especially with one girl in particular whose name was Lucy. And she was just this like bright sunshine person who, blonde, beautiful, kind of ditzy, but very sweet and nice. And Rebecca was just drawn to her. And the whole premise of this is really reminding me of the TV show Wednesday, which I just watched, which is probably coincidence. These are kind of just common gothic tropes, but yeah, very similar to that. Think of that. So this pulls her out of her depression. And now 2 years later, she is very excited to start her junior year. She and Lucy are going to be suite mates. They have a dorm where they each have their own room, but it's connected by a Jack and Jill bathroom so that they can just go in and out of each other's room. The school's rules are very strict. They have a lights out. They can't be out in the hallways. So when girls want to hang out after lights out, you know, they sneak into each other's rooms, they climb out the windows, they do lots of things to break the rules. And she's kind of a good girl. She's a little nerd. She loves literature. Her father was a poet and her mom's a painter, so she considers herself very artistic. But she is not like the snobbiest, most pretentious girl in the school. She is the second snobbiest, most pretentious girl in the school. The first snobbiest one is a girl named Dora, who is just like obsessed with Nietzsche and is writing a novel about Brahms, like real person fanfic, and she's just so pretentious about it that Rebecca comes off as less bad. But Rebecca is a very judgmental teenager. She is very self-absorbed, very judgmental, but sympathetic at the same time. I didn't hate her. When I was reading the mean things she was saying about the other girls, like even when she talks about her best friend Lucy and she's saying how, you know, ditzy she is and how unintellectual she is, I didn't hate her for that. I was just like, girls, you'll grow out of it and you'll feel bad about it later. But one thing that sets her apart, besides having, you know, a bad home life, is she's one of the only Jewish girls in this school. And this is in 1970s in New England. I'm not sure exactly where in New England. She's from New York City, but she's sent away to a place, you know, remote. And the people there are very anti-Semitic to her. The people that are popular are the WASP girls with the blonde hair and the blue eyes, who are good at sports. And she, the bookish girl, the Jewish girl with, you know, the dark curly hair, is an outcast. Most of the girls are really nice to her, but the teachers are kind of anti-Semitic to her, and she has trouble with the gym teachers not putting her on teams because they don't like her, that kind of stuff. So Dora, the other snob, is also Jewish, but Rebecca thinks not Jewish enough. She is not Jewish enough because, you know, she just like partially. And she says that Dora is only Jewish when it's convenient for her to show off, and then she can like turn it off and not be, you know, be WASP passing if she wants. So at the beginning of the school year, a new girl shows up, and she says it's very odd for new girls to show up just like partway through high school. Usually you start as a freshman and go all the way through. No one starts as a junior. But this is a new boarding student, and she is also Jewish. And, you know, dark hair, pale skin. And so Rebecca has sort of like an attraction to be like, oh, maybe she's cool, maybe we're like each other. But then someone else says like, oh, you two should get along because you're the same kind. That also kind of turns her off from it. But this girl's name is Ernessa. She is very mysterious, very strange. She talks in a weird, old-fashioned way. She doesn't decorate her room. Her room is very sparse. When she's first in her room, she just like picks up her dresser and moves it without even like struggling, so she has weird strength. And she's just a strange, antisocial girl. So as the school year progresses, Rebecca and Lucy are having a great time, but Lucy and Ernessa start getting close. And she talks about like the way they do meals in the school and the structured way they all, after meals, they all go to this room called the playroom, which is just like a parlor, a salon where they can all smoke because it's 1970 and teenagers smoke. And Ernessa always comes there and smoke, but she notices things about Ernessa, like she never eats her food. She never seems to get affected by the pot she smokes because she's also dealing drugs to the other girls who are all like, you know, it's very hippie 1970s pot smoking American style. So she's dealing drugs, and we learn a lot about all of Rebecca's friends, and there's a lot of them. At first, it's kind of overwhelming to keep up because a few of them have names that even sound similar. So you're like, wait, which one's which? But the book actually does a really good job of letting you know these characters all as individuals. And you do get to a point where you can tell them apart and know which one's which and why that matters and how those people fit into the narrator's life. And that was impressive to me because that's hard to do in a book. Easier to do on TV because you can give visual cues to distinguish people. But in a book, it's you know, it's more difficult. And a lot of times if you're trying to get a book published, especially as a first-time author, editors will tell you too many characters, combine the characters, shrink down your cast, people get confused. But this author did it really well. And I was pretty impressed with that. So as the year goes on, Lucy and Ernessa start getting close. So Rebecca starts getting a bit jealous about that because she feels like she's losing her best friend. And the other thing is that they have a male teacher this year. It's very rare for them to see any men during the school year, and they have a male English teacher. And so she's taking one of his classes, which is about like Gothic literature. So she's reading books like Carmilla and other things that fit in kind of in a meta way to the life she's living too. And she starts getting suspicious of Ernessa, and obviously she starts thinking she's a vampire because it's Vampire Book Club, and she keeps comparing her to Carmilla. Because as a vampire, she kind of fits the way Carmilla works more than any other. I wouldn't call this a Carmilla retelling, but it does use a lot of tropes from Carmilla. So it's sort of like, well, maybe if Carmilla was a true story, this is another story similar to that. So we just read a lot about like the drama that's going on in this girls' school and the way the girls interact with each other. It's very real. There's not really much plot to it. It's just kind of the slow growing suspicion of Ernessa is a vampire and she's preying on Lucy. And as the year goes on, and she's suspecting it, she tries to spy on Ernessa, and she notices more and more weird things about her. Like her room always smells like dead animals, and she sees her coming out of the basement, and there's this weird rotting dead animal stench in the basement. And the janitor is, he's like, oh, I don't know where all these dead animals came from. So it's implied that Ernessa's down there feeding on them. And will kind of show up and say cryptic things and then disappear. They never really see her go out in the sun. She never actually eats any of her food. And she seems to be kind of brainwashing Lucy. Lucy and the narrator fall out and they're not friends anymore, and she starts being really resentful of her. And then there's scenes where she goes home for, Christmas break and spring break with her mom, and we learn a lot more about her backstory with her dad and how attached to her dad she was. She has a lot of really weird, trippy dreams that are very similar to the dreams Laura has in Carmilla, where, the vampire comes to her. There's one point where she and Dora try to, they climb out the window, they go to Ernessa's window to spy into her room. And when she looks in the room, she sees that the room is covered in dust, like no one's lived in there for years. And then all the dust turns into moths, and the moths start flying at her, and she gets really scared. But when they look in the room the next day, there's no dust, it's clean. Where did all that go? And she also tells a story about how she and her father would go out at night and shine a flashlight to try to find moths. And one night they found this beautiful Luna moth, and it's one of her favorite memories with her father. So that's probably why it's called the Moth Diaries, even though moths don't really feature in any other part of it. Moths are a creature that are often associated with vampires, but it could have been called the Bat Diaries, like basically kind of the same concept, only less cliche. So after that, when she and Dora spy, Dora says she's going to spy again, and then the next morning, the narrator says, no, I'm done. I'm not going to do it. You shouldn't do it either. So the next morning they wake up and Dora has fallen off the window ledge and is dead. And she's the only one who notices that there's no way she could have just like accidentally fallen off the gutter, because then she would have hit the roof. She was launched off down to the courtyard pavement. And so everyone thinks that she jumped, like she was a suicidal teenager and jumped. But the narrator knows that's not true, and she knows that Ernessa must have done it. There's also a point where one of the teachers has this very yappy little dog, and Ernessa's talking about how much she hates the dog, and then shortly after, the dog is found with its throat slit out in the yard. And she's the only one who believes Ernessa is doing it. She tries to talk to other friends about it, and they're all like, why are you so obsessed with her? You're going crazy. Don't talk to us. And the only person who had really believed her were Dora and this other girl, Charlie, who Ernessa gets expelled from school even before that. Charlie was a pothead that Ernessa sold drugs to, but she did this thing where she took all the girls out, not the narrator, but a bunch of the other girls out, and they all got high, and she slipped something into their drugs that made Charlie kind of lose it and go crazy, and she stole a car and got arrested, so she gets expelled from school. So everyone who's the narrator is convincing that Ernessa might be a vampire, she's getting rid of them. And she has this concept that Ernessa wants her to see who she is. Ernessa needs some kind of witness that knows what she is, and she'll kind of look at Ernessa and see her and why she's picked Lucy to prey on, but that's the way it is. just got a notification that OBS stopped working. Hope I didn't lose connection. I'm gonna wait and see if I'm still running. YouTube is like, now would be a good time to insert ads. Do you want to insert an ad right now? No, I do not, YouTube. It's back. Okay, what was the last thing you heard me say? What was the last thing you heard me say? Because I'll repeat anything that you missed. Oh, okay. So the last thing you heard me say was when she got Charlie expelled. And, okay, great. So she doesn't know why Ernessa wants her to be the one that sees through, and she doesn't know why she's targeting Lucy. And she's just this sort of mystery she's trying to solve, but nobody believes her. And she's obsessed with journaling. She's always writing into her diary, obviously, because this is what we're reading. And she tries to tell the teacher, the male teacher, Mr. Davies, but he's acting weird with her. He keeps flirting with her. And there was earlier in the semester, there was another girl who was always very jealous of the way Mr. Davies was paying attention to her because she had a big old crush on him. But the narrator doesn't seem interested in Mr. Davies at all. She liked talking to him about books and literature, but he started creeping her out and she pulled away. And there's this running throughout the whole book. It talks about the way the girls interact with each other, living together. They're very touchy-feely. They look at each other naked all the time. They take baths together. They pee in front of each other with the door open. And Ernessa's the only one who never does this, who sort of like is grossed out by it. But the narrator talks about how it's like normal. It's just what they're used to. But when the daytime students come, who don't live at the school, see them, they call them lesbians, and they act really weirded out by it. But she's like, we're not lesbians, I swear. You know, she's a bit homophobic about it. And she says that's just, you know, the kind of closeness they have. So the longer it goes on, the more it seems like she might actually be queer, and maybe that's the way the other girls are, but she does seem to take it further. And she talks about how she and Lucy always promised each other that they would never cross that line, and they would joke about it and say like, oh no, you know, we can take baths together and like hold hands, but we wouldn't go that far. And there's this sort of like unspoken concept they have. And we know based on the preface that the narrator grows up and marries a man and has children, so you would think like, oh, maybe she is straight and is just closest. But her obsession with these girls and the way she is just attached to Lucy definitely speaks of something that is more queer and there, even though she won't admit to herself. She's only 16, you know, she hasn't really discovered her sexuality yet. But Ernessa and Lucy are definitely crossing those lines. At least she thinks. It gets to the point where we don't know if what she's seeing is real or if it's dreams or if she is, you know, schizophrenic or whatever it is where she's seeing things, but she sees them in bed together having sex sort of, and she's just shocked that Lucy would actually go there with another girl, even though they had promised each other for so long that they would never cross that line. So she, well, you know, if she marries a man, you think like, oh, maybe she's bi, right? I see what you're saying. But as she's writing in her journal, she does not seem interested in men at all. She seems put off by men. And so it may be like a compet situation with her husband, just from the way it reads. She talks about the other girls having boyfriends and how she gets hopeful of like meeting a boy who'll be sophisticated and make her feel special, but she never does. And so all the boys she knows repulse her. And when Mr. Davies flirts with her, it puts her off because he's being creepy, even though all of the other girls think he's hot. And there is a part where he molests her later, and she doesn't find it sexual at all. She's just like, oh, it was a comforting thing. He was just trying to like connect with me, and therefore it's okay. And she doesn't see it as him being sexual. You know, and I think that's like her not being accurate, and this guy is a creep who did molest her. But it doesn't turn her on. She's not like attracted to him in that way at all. So there's a point where Ernessa keeps getting in trouble because she skips gym class all the time. She never wants to do exercise, even though she's a very healthy looking girl. And Lucy is getting weaker and weaker, so the narrator thinks, you know, she's feeding on Lucy. She doesn't really see her drink blood, but she thinks she's sort of an energy vampire. Like, there is no real blood drinking, but like an energy vampire. And she gets punished for skipping all her classes because she sleeps every day. She's awake all night and sleeps all day. And they do see her sleepwalking at night, kind of like how Laura sees Carmilla in the book, and she goes through a window without the window being open. She can sort of materialize and pass through walls. But the teacher, who hates Jews, punishes her by making her swim laps every day. And Ernessa is just livid because, like vampires, going into water is not good for her. She can go in the earth, but she can't go into the water. So swimming, having to do these laps is torture. And the narrator sneaks in and watches her swim the laps and see how she's suffering. And usually Ernessa wears clothes head to toe, even on hot days. Her entire body's covered except her face. So when she sees her in her bathing suit, she sees that her skin is weird and blotchy, and she sees how the water is consuming her. And, she's mad about it. So this horrible teacher, who has been horrible to any Jewish girl, ends up dead. Shortly after, she looks like she's been ripped apart by an animal. And the narrator has also noted that she's kind of implied that Ernessa can turn into a big black cat, the same way Carmilla does in the book. And you never know if the things that she's applying to Ernessa are just taken straight from Carmilla, or if that's also a thing that Ernessa does and it's that similar. She's been researching vampires a lot. She reads all the vampire books she can find. She makes a list of all vampire traits and how you become a vampire. Being suicidal is one way to become a vampire. Not having your remains disposed of in the right way is one way to become a vampire. And this connects with her because that's what her father is, and her father kind of haunts her, and her mother talks about the father's haunting her too in dreams. Not literally. She doesn't see ghosts. Ghosts don't seem to be existent in here, but vampires are. So yeah, the implication is that Ernessa shapeshifted into a jaguar or whatever and shredded the gym teacher. So now there's been the dog death, Dora's death, and the gym teacher's death, and she thinks like, oh, this school is done for, nobody's going to want to come back to the school after. And Lucy is just fading away. So Lucy gets sent off to the hospital because she's just like, all her energy is gone, nothing she can do can give her energy again. And she's gone for a while, and then she gets better, and then she comes back. But while she's gone, the narrator wants to visit her, but they will not let her visit her any way whatsoever. They're just like barring her from visiting her, but Ernessa gets to visit her. And after the times Ernessa visits her, of course, Lucy relapses and gets worse. So then Lucy's mom says, okay, Ernessa can't visit her anymore. And then Lucy finally gets better, comes back to school for a while. They're friends again. They're like, everything is like it used to be. And then eventually Ernessa starts preying on Lucy again. Or is she? We don't know. Lucy starts wasting away again. And the ending is Lucy dies. So now that's a third person that's died this year. So the narrator is convinced Ernessa is a vampire, and she tries to tell the teacher. He doesn't believe her. They send her to the school psychiatrist, and she starts talking about, dealing with the grief of her father and how it can manifest and why she might be, having a mental breakdown. And she goes down to the basement where all the dead animals used to be, and she goes into where all the border girls keep their trunks, because when they move into school, they bring their trunk full of belongings. Back in the 1970s, when people used trunks instead of suitcases, and all the trunks are stored in the basement for the school year. So she finds Ernessa's trunk, and of course it looks really old-fashioned and weird and has travel stickers that are way older than Ernessa could possibly be. She's found like books of Ernessa's that are clearly 100 years old, even though Ernessa's supposedly only 16. So she opens up Ernessa's trunk, and it's full of dirt and leaves and animal poop and just kind of all these weird natural woodsy things. So she thinks, okay, she's a vampire and this is where she sleeps. And she also finds Ernessa's diary in there, and the diary has dates going back 100 years, but all they say for every single date is the weather. And she's like, of course the weather would be most important to a vampire because she can't go outside if it's sunny and the weather affects her. Did I skip over the bit in the library? Yes, I've skipped over a lot of bits. We can always go back. Because this book doesn't really have a linear plot, it's very hard to summarize the way I usually do. Usually I can go through a book and just like tell you start to finish what happens. But a lot of this book is things happening and then her thinking back on them later and understanding them. So yeah. So at the climax of the book, the way it ends is she sets fire to Ernesta's trunk when she knows Ernesta should be sleeping in the trunk as a way to try to kill her. Not just as revenge for Lucy's death, but just to stop this vampire from doing these things. And she does it. She burns the trunk and the fire alarms go off and everyone goes outside and they have the fire drill and she's like covered in soot. So of course everyone knows she set the fire, and also she's been the crazy girl accusing Ernesta of being a vampire for months. And the firefighters come and they put out the fire, but everything in the basement has been burned and destroyed. So she's like, yes, it worked. I didn't care. I wasn't trying to burn down the school. I was just trying to burn Ernesta in her trunk. But then Ernesta comes out of the school completely unharmed and gets in a car and drives away. Like, her trunk is gone, so she can't stay at the school, but somehow she survived the fire, somehow she got out, somehow she's still going. And the person who picks her up is a strange man, and Ernesta's tragic backstory was that her father died too, so it couldn't be her father. They don't know who this man is that picks her up, and it's the same man who picked her up for Christmas break. And yeah, it's kind of a bummer ending that Ernesta lives on. Her backstory, as we are led to be implied, is that 100 years ago or whatever, because this school used to be a hotel back in oldie times, Ernesta's father had died and she and her mother had come to this hotel to try to recover. And her mother recovered, but Ernesta never did and became a vampire. And whether it was because her father also had become a vampire or what, and maybe that was her father in the car who was a vampire or something else. So she became a vampire, and now she's come back to the same hotel where she became a vampire decades later and is preying on people again. It seems very cyclical with her. So now that it's a school, she comes back even though it's the same building. And then at the end of the book, it ends with the fire. It ends with her writing in her journal after the fire. She goes to her teacher's room, the one teacher she liked, and is writing in her journal. And then she's like, oh, I hear people coming to get me. This is goodbye. And she's reached the end of her journal, and that's how it ends. And then the afterword is her again 30 years later talking about where she is now, how it felt. We find out that she spent her senior year of high school in a psychiatric ward, and now she's looking back on it after having grown up and lived a normie compet life and having children, and thinking like, well, I don't know. I'm not sure how I feel, but you know, that was a real person in a real set of time. So someone in the book club said that they didn't like the afterword because they thought it destroyed the ambiguity of whether she was crazy or whether it really happened. But I don't think it did. I think she, after the fact, was kind of brainwashed into thinking she was just crazy and that it never really happened, and that's where she is now. But having actually read it, I think it probably did really happen, and you know, that year in the psychiatric hospital and everything that's happened to her since is what's made her think that, you know, it gaslighted her into not thinking it was real. And I think the ambiguity is still there. It's very similar to the afterword in Carmilla when Laura, many years later, is talking about how she's free and she's fine, but every once in a while she'll hear someone and think, oh no, it's Carmilla about to walk into the room. So it is sort of that same ambiguous of, is the vampire really gone? No, the Carmilla vibes were intentional. The Carmilla vibes were definitely intentional. And in the book, she is reading Carmilla and comparing her life to Carmilla. So it's not supposed to be a retelling or a modernization of Carmilla. It's just a meta commentary. The scene in the library you were talking about, there are a couple scenes in the library. She says she doesn't like to go to the library much because girls in there talk and she can't concentrate. And she's very focused and very like solitary, so she likes to do her homework in her room because she's a super nerd and like everything is literary references with her. And she's reading all these books and she'll put quotes from the books she's reading in her diary as she's going through. And I was just like, damn, this girl's really smart. She's way more well-read than I was at 16. But there were a couple scenes in the library where Ernesta just shows up and starts creeping on her. And tells her weird things about her backstory, and then she has a hallucination that Ernessa slits her wrist with a razor blade and bleeds everywhere and then disappears. And everything's gone. She's like, did that really happen? I don't know. And she sees Ernessa next time. She's completely normal, but the razor blade is still there, and she keeps this razor blade, and she sort of has thoughts about maybe using it. And we do find out that if Ernessa's tragic backstory was real 100 years ago, the way she became a vampire when her mother recovered but she didn't was she slit her wrists in the bathtub at that hotel, and because it was suicide, that's how she turned into a vampire. Yeah, there was a lot of philosophical contemplation in this book of her concept of what is real, what is not real. Because her father was a poet and Mr. Davies is a poet, she talks a lot about like what makes poetry real. If someone writes something, when does it become real to the writer, a reality? And Mr. Davies is like, the supernatural isn't real, right? It's just stories. And she's like, but no, it became real to the writer, so it is real in her concept of reality. And it's kind of like pretentiously teenagery, but, interesting. And she talks about having the soul of the poet. And she's very judgmental of Mr. Davies compared to her father, because first the other girls think, oh, Mr. Davies only likes you because your father was a famous poet and he wants to get close to you through him. And she doesn't think Mr. Davies is a real poet. He's not good enough. She's very judgy about it. And she goes to his house at one point with another friend and meets his wife and, the baby, his nephew's baby, or his baby nephew. And she's like, oh, it's not the house of a poet. But then she actually hears his poetry at one point. She's like, I was surprised by how good it was. And there's a lot of points where she talks about the girls around her. It's like, oh, she's my friend, and she says nice things about her. But then later on, she's like, she was never really my friend because this one thing she did means she couldn't have been my friend. And then she goes back and forth on them. Very dramatic teenagery, but also very much speaking towards someone who's not mentally healthy. And the way she's just like awful to her friends on paper is sort of the thing like, the thoughts that you have in your head are bad, but you're not a bad person unless you act on them, that kind of thing. And she does come through for her friends in the most part. She often talks about how she's kind of sick of helping Lucy with her homework and she just wishes Lucy would go away. Meanwhile, she's upset that Lucy is going away because she's completely obsessed with her. And it never really comes through as romantic in a normal, healthy romantic sense, but it is very obsessive. The book being discussed is The Moth Diaries. We are also discussing Carmilla a little bit because The Moth Diaries discusses Carmilla. Someone mentioned Lucy's cross necklace. So Lucy always wore a cross necklace. She's a very perfect little Christian girl, very waspy. She would get up early and go to church every morning when church was held. And, the narrator was kind of going under duress, singing the hymns under duress because she's Jewish, and it made her feel like, am I being a bad Jew? And she sort of had an identity crisis over it. But Lucy, very Christian, and she always wore a gold cross. And one day it disappears. She can't find it anywhere. And then after she dies, they find it in her jewelry box right where it should be. So she's like, Lucy knew where it was all along, and it was her choice to not wear it. There's also a part where she talks about having gone previously to Lucy's home to see her family. And she always thought Lucy was like this perfect little golden child with a perfect little life. So she goes home and she meets Lucy's mom, and her mom is just as blonde and ditzy as Lucy is. But when she gets there, she sees how awful her dad is. Besides just being physically repulsive to her because, he's sitting around in his underwear and his skin is red and blotchy and he's very crass and, he's fat and she's very fat phobic. There's a lot of body talk and weight talk in this book as well. And he's just kind of like gross and mean to the women in the house. And it ruins her idea of Lucy being this perfect golden child because like Lucy's not allowed to have a bad relationship with her father. She's not allowed to be more complex and deep than I have already made her in my head. She's supposed to be shallow. She's supposed to be my ditzy friend to make me feel deep. And her learning that Lucy did have this trauma in her life, did have this trouble in her life, was kind of a wake-up call for her. And she talks about how all the girls who live at the school do have some sort of traumatic life story and are recovering in a way. But they aren't sent there because of that. Like, it's not a school that's meant for that. It's just like, well, maybe everybody has some damage. You know, really makes you think. No, I don't think the narrator was bad either. I think, you know, she was bitchy sometimes, she was petty sometimes, but, you know, she's allowed to be. Like, teenagers are teenagers. You know, there's a lot going on in the internet right now. I don't know if this exists in the real world, but like fandom spaces on the internet where people are responding and having these communities around fictional stories, right? You know, whether it's TV shows or books or whatever, fandom spaces of this purity culture thing about you're only allowed to like characters who are completely pure and you can't like a problematic character, and, you know, the pro-ship wars versus the anti-ship wars and all this stuff. This is not a character that would stand up in those spaces right now. But when it was written in 2002, I think this is a very real character, a real human with like good sides, bad sides. Can she be defined by her worst moments? No, but like she'll grow. She does grow. She's 16. She's allowed to make these mistakes. She's allowed to like have these bad feelings and then learn from them later. So about the body stuff, she does talk a lot about the diets her friends go on, how they're always trying to get skinny. It is 1970s, so like that sort of 70s body type that was popular at the time. She talks about other girls' boobs all the time, and the weird diets she goes on, and how Lucy has this perfect body and she's so skinny, but she has a little pot belly, and that's her one flaw. And then there's at one point where Lucy is wasting away, and one of the girls is like, oh, she finally got rid of that pot belly, now she's finally hot. And of course, you know, she's dying, and then she dies. And her one friend, Sophia, who's Italian, so that's why she's an outcast compared to all the blonde waspy girls. Even though she's not Jewish, she has that similarity. She gets a boyfriend at one point and loses her virginity, and it's kind of traumatic for her, and it's kind of awful, and, you know, the narrator is by her side through it, and Sophia's kind of her one friend who sticks with her. But then there's one point where she feels like, even Sophia doesn't like me anymore. She was never my friend, and, you know, she's going off like that, very black and white. But at the end of the book, when, you know, Lucy dies, all the other girls are being very catty about it and sort of blaming her for Lucy's death. Sophia comes to her and is like, tries to tell her about it, and she's like, I'm trying to help you. You know, even despite everything, she does come through. How long is the book? It's about 250 pages, a little less. Not very long at all. I read it in 2 days. I started it yesterday, finished it today. Or day before yesterday. So, I really like this book. A lot of the books we reviewed for Vampire Book Club, I'm very critical of, or maybe I heard a lot of hype about it and then I was disappointed. I kind of wasn't expecting to think much of this book, because when the movie came out, the movie was put into that post-Twilight boom YA teenager vampire thing, and it did seem very much to be riding on that, even though it was an art film, even though it was a small film that only went to like art house theaters. And I judged it on that. But now knowing that its origins was before all that stereotype, and having read it, it's just like a gothic novel, not a YA novel, and I love gothic novels, and it's very well done. The writing is amazing, even though it was this author's first and only novel. Clearly she's a genius. This is probably maybe the second favorite book I've read in Vampire Book Club so far. This one's way up there, and I was prejudging it unfairly and not giving it enough credit, and I'm very glad that I finally read it. And if you didn't read it for Vampire Book Club, I would highly recommend it. It doesn't matter that I've spoiled it for you. It's about the journey. It's about all the little details along the way, all the tiny things she remembers about her dad in the margins, and all the little tidbits about the girls' lives throughout it. Very good. I remember liking the movie but having a lot of criticisms about it, And I don't know if that's because at the time I thought I should, because it was that sort of like, we're too cool for vampires era. And it was only very shortly after I had started doing vampire reviews and was still just like getting into the world of vampires. But even if the movie's a product of its time to its detriment, the book is not. Read the book. I loved it. If you just like gothic stories, gothic novels, the ambiance is amazing. The setting is amazing. The writing is wonderful. All the literary references are just like so fun because you're just like, oh, it's so smart. And not in a pretentious way. Even though the narrator is pretentious, the book is not in any way whatsoever. It is wonderful. Very real. Oh, which was my favorite book that we read? Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. That was a great book. That was fun. I wouldn't call this book fun. And I do like fun. But it is gothic, and I do like gothic. Two very different books. I have already explained what I'm drinking, but I will explain it again. You missed it at the beginning of the... This is Noda Brewing Company, local Charlotte beer. Captain Peanut Butter's Chocolate Revenge. It's an imperial porter brewed with cocoa nibs and peanut butter. And it is 9.2% ABV. And this comes in a 16-ounce can, which I'm drinking out of a glass. I really hated the writing, but loved the style of the movie. Yeah, I think it was one of those scripts that was just trying to be like, let's give audiences what they think they want right now. And, yeah, could have been better. The writing in the movie was nothing like the writing in the book. The visuals in the movie, I remember being very cool, very artistic. I have not watched that review I did since I made it. So I'm only remembering what I thought I said about it. What was that? 11 years ago? That was 2011, so it's 2022. Yeah. I've been talking to you about vampires for a very long time to remember something I said 11 years ago. Where did I find the film? Well, I saw it in theaters. I lived in New York City, so every film will exist in some theater. I went to the tiny art house theater in New York City and saw it in a room that only had, 30 seats in it. But you can find it online now, right? I don't know. I don't own it as a film. I don't think. Maybe I do. Actually, did someone send it to me? I would like to watch it again now that I've read the book. I remember the movie being explicitly gay at one point. Well, see, when I watched the movie, I came out of it being like, oh, this is a Carmilla modernization, and most people don't even know Carmilla exists, and me drawing that connection made me feel very literary and smart. Like nowadays we think of like, oh, Carmilla, everyone knows Carmilla, of course, you're not jumping to any sort of brilliance here, but back then we were. What do I find the vampire stands for in this book? Trauma, grief, the processing of grief and trauma, the disconnection you can feel, because grief is a very isolating feeling, right? Everyone goes through it at some point in their lives, but when you're the one going through it, you can't connect with anyone. It's completely isolating. Everyone's grief is personal. And I feel like the vampire, the way it sort of separated her from her peers and pulled her into this obsession that no one could believe her in, had that same feeling of, your own personal grief and what you're going through. When someone dies, when your family falls apart, because it wasn't just her father committing suicide, it was the relationship with her mother changing, her entire life changing. At one point, her mother's like, what happened to all your friends that you had before you went off to this boarding school? You used to talk to them every summer. She's like, oh, I just don't connect with them anymore. This entirely isolating experience. And she talks about the way the vampire is, even if she's not drinking her blood, she is sucking the life away from someone, and the way that like grief and trauma and tragedy can suck your life away and make you into a different person. She talks about how I'm a different person now than I was last year, and how Lucy's a different person now than she was, and the Lucy who was my friend is gone, and this new Lucy exists. And then Lucy talks about it too. She's like, I'm a different person now, and you need to accept me for who I am. You don't even like me. You only like who I used to be, and that's not me, so therefore you don't like me. Yeah, it's just a very well done book. It has good reread value too, I think. Now that you get to the end and you have all those little backstory bits filled in, you can go back in, because she'll start writing in her diary about something that she assumes you know, which you don't. Like, she's talking about someone named Milio dying. You don't know who this person is. Turns out it was a cat. And it's pretty obvious from the beginning that it's a pet, but you don't know whether it's a dog or a cat. And she's just talking about it by name, because that's how you write in your diary. You're not going to start your diary with, like, by the way, my cat, comma, Milio, comma, she just talks about things in a real way. And she talks about these girls she knows without introducing them to the reader, without describing them in a, she's not treating this diary like a story that should be told. She's just treating it the way she understands it. And then the reader gets it from context clues throughout. So I think it's a very well-written way to do it, and I like it. Not that introducing characters and describing them is a bad thing. It's just a different style. You guys are asking me some great questions, so I'm kind of scrolling up again. If I missed your question, feel free to ask it again. I wish the moth theme played more in with the vampire theme that was presented here in the book and the movie as well. Me too, because moths are very cool imagery. In the movie, you see them and they're cool, but it's kind of just as minimal as it is in the book. There's only 2 mentions of moths, and there's never a point where she's comparing herself to a moth. I mean, she does talk about how you're drawn to a vampire like the way a moth is drawn to the moon or to the light. So if anyone's a moth, it's Lucy, right? Lucy's the one drawn. But is she also the moth? Because of the Moth Diaries, it's her diary. So is she drawn to the obsession with them? Like, she's not drawn to Ernessa in any way that's attractive, but she's completely obsessed with Ernessa. The way a moth is drawn to a flame that will destroy it, like a bug zapper. But I would have liked more moths. You were absolutely correct. You found her more gay with Sophia than Lucy at some points. They were sitting in each other's laps and felt a lot more healthily close. Yeah, she and Sophia were definitely more than friends without either of them realizing it. Sophia goes off and has sex with a boy, and she's like, I don't love him. It wasn't a fun experience. I'm glad I got rid of my virginity. I'm glad I did it, but it was, uncomfortable. She was in pain. It was not fun for her, so she's not attracted to that guy. Maybe she's not attracted to any guys. Maybe she is also anti-man. We don't know. She talks about how all the girls will eventually grow up to be the same kind of woman. These like matronly women who wear pearls around their neck like it's a rosary, like it's a uniform. And they all turn into the same mom types. And she doesn't want to ever turn into that, because her mom's not like those matronly women. Her mom's still skinny and vibrant and a painter, not like all the other ways the WASP women turn out. And, she's coming at it from a very 1960s, 70s point of view. 30 years later, it's 2002. People aren't wearing like Chanel suits and pearls, but they do have this way of approaching the class reunion 30 years later. And they do turn out to be exactly what she thought they would. It's really very excellent. Character voices and atmosphere and themes were brilliant. They were. I agree completely. The narrator understands some very real things about adolescence and grief not a lot of people talk about, like dreams of someone who's dead. That's very real. Yes. It made me wonder if the author had gone through this. I tried Googling the author and looking into her, which is how I found out this was her only book. The author is Jewish as well. so that part's self-insert. Her father was a Nobel Prize winning economist. So the father of this person was a famous poet. So you do have that sort of like amazing dad figure. It didn't seem like she had a suicide of a parent at all, at least not in my quick Google search that I found. So I don't know that that part was real. But the pain definitely felt like she was speaking from experience. So I don't know how much of herself she put into this book, but it did make me wonder that, like, how do you write something this visceral and effective without having some of those feelings yourself? What are my thoughts on the are they, aren't they a vampire plot? It's well executed here, and I would say in Bunnicula, very different tone. Some people find it annoying. I don't find it annoying. I like the ambiguity. I like the brain fuckery of it. You know, that's the gothic tone of you don't know what's real or what's not. Madness is definitely a huge part of the gothic. And am I going crazy, or is this really happening? And why is it really happening if so? And will anyone believe me? Because even if it is real, even if the character is not mad, people often think they're mad. And that's why all these, you know, young ladies get sent off to asylums for hysteria. And that isolation of not being believed is a big part of it. So I liked that this tapped into that and did such a gothic thing. Yes, set in a historical setting in 1970, but it's still modernized. Oh, one thing I noticed, she talks about how Lucy gets this record, a Cat Stevens record. And I looked up that record before I saw the date clues to figure out, yes, it's exactly 1970. Because originally she said 30 years ago. It came out in 2002, so I thought 1972. So I looked up this record. It came out in November of 1970, so I was like, okay, so maybe this is 1971 or 72, and that's why she has this record. But then when I looked up the dates, I was like, no, it's exactly 1970. And she gets the record in September because she's heard her friend playing it, and it's got, like, she got obsessed with this record her friend's been playing a while ago, and then she gets in September, October. The record didn't come out till late November, so that's a historical continuity error here, which, that was disappointing. It feels like the author was writing and being like, oh yeah, that record came out in the 70s. I remember that. And she had the character have heard and gotten into and then bought for herself this record months before it actually came out. Just a nitpick. Does this book remind you immediately of another modern book? Not off the top of my head. Is there one you have in mind? It reminds me of Wednesday. I just watched Wednesday, the new Netflix series about Wednesday Addams, and it did remind me a lot of that. No vampires in that, and Wednesday's not crazy, and she is solving a real mystery, but the whole dynamic of, like, the dark girl full of woe with the sunshine roommate and all of that stuff, there's a lot of similarity there. Moths that drink blood? I didn't know about that. That's really cool. Moth, kind of like the butterfly, could also be seen as a metaphor for transformation. I'm not sure if that theme would apply. Well, butterflies are a symbol of death. I took a Memento Mori online class last year, and we learned a lot about how butterflies are used in death imagery because, you know, sort of the thought that after you die, your soul transforms and becomes a butterfly. And so they would put butterflies in death imagery. Not moths quite so much, but obviously the moths are the darker gothic version of butterflies, so, you know, that makes it spookier. Sorry, my nose is itching. I don't want to scratch my nose, so I'm just, like, wiping it with a tissue. You're bummed that the author never wrote more? Me too, but, you know, it's only been 20 years since she wrote this book. Maybe she'll write another one. Some authors are like this. The themes in the book are so dark. I love it. I do too. I love dark themes. Someone asked me if they would consider this horror. Well, it's gothic. You know, gothic is a form of horror, but it's not, like, scary, and it's not gory. It's its own subset of horror. Moths, a symbol of death, is a big thing in Japan. That's cool. I didn't get any Japanese influence in this book at all, but that's cool. A vampire moth that sucks blood. I would like to learn more about this vampire moth who sucks blood. You loved how the book allowed the reader to fill in the blanks so that no matter the interpretation, it isn't really wrong. That is entirely true. So to people who felt that the afterword ruined the ambiguity and confirmed that she was just crazy all along, I disagree. I think the afterword confirmed nothing. It just showed that she escaped and moved on. But not really, because it would always haunt her in a way. But she did survive, right? She is a survivor. She is living a calm pet life, which makes me sad for her, because this part of her adolescence where she went through this horrible experience was also sexual to her, was also part of her sexual identity, and she lost that as well. She lost the bad parts, but she also lost that, which makes me sad for her. You know, she talks about how I didn't grow up to be the pearl-wearing wasp stereotype, but yeah, you're still living a compact life. It's still pretty sad. What do I think was the point of the sexual assault plot point? I don't know. It grossed me out. I was just like, oh man, I thought, you know, they have this one male teacher and all the girls are in love with him, but not her. She doesn't seem that way, but she does like talking about books with him. And you don't know if she's lying and like deluding herself, and she does have a crush on him. But then when he does molest her, she doesn't react to it erotically. But it comforts her. It's really weird. And by then she's already kind of lost it. But then you wonder, like, did he even do that to her? Or was this some kind of weird fantasy that she had? Like, you don't know how much of this is really real to her at this point. And, you know, there's also, you know, he's sort of seen as this, like, pure, innocent, married man who writes poetry and all the girls are in love with him, but he's a good guy. And then there's a rumor that gets started that he actually has a side gig writing pornography with his wife, and you know, he and his wife write smut for money, and of course it's very scandalous in 1971, and all the girls are like, oh, that's horrible, and it's like, what's wrong with writing smut? Everyone on the internet does it, but it's bad then. So therefore he's a pervert and a deviant, and then he molests her, and even though she doesn't react to it in a way that is traumatizing to her, it is very unsettling and off-putting to the reader, because, you know, you wanted to like this teacher or think he could be helpful or useful to her, or even though he doesn't believe her that Ernest is a vampire, maybe he can just be supportive. But nope, takes advantage of her and gropes her. And why her? Because she was smart when all the other girls were ditzes? Does that make her special, that she's molestable to him? I don't think it's bad that it was in there, or, you know, pointless. It's just part of the whole. Is kind of another disillusionment. Yep, there's lots of moths in Crimson Peak. That's going on the exact same tropes that this book is going on. I haven't read The Room. I have it. I got it as a gift for Christmas years ago, and I still haven't read it. Actually, Ton the Shadows gave it to me for Christmas one year. Still haven't read it or seen the movie. The author intended to frame things in a way that felt true to the period with regard to normalizing things that aren't actually acceptable versus things like queerness that were stigmatized. Yes, very much so. It was very much of its time, you know. Even though it's not a narrator who's remembering things and be like, oh, maybe she's remembering it wrong because it was 30 years ago. No, she's writing about it in the moment. We're just reading her diary from that time. Things, you know, at the time, like fat phobia, weren't seen as bad. You know, whereas homophobia was accepted. Like, oh no, being queer is bad. Or, you know, the sexual assault wasn't something that would be dealt with as severely as it would be today. I think that's a very good point. The girls often normalized having adult boyfriends, partners in their convos when they're underage. Yes, very much so. Which would not fly today, but in 1970, apparently, the times. Oh, you mean The Room? The Tommy Wiseau movie. I thought you meant Room, the other movie. I have seen The Room, the Tommy Wiseau movie. I went to a rowdy screening of it in New York City, and we threw spoons at the screen. There was a version where he was a vampire. I did not know about that. That's weird, because there's nothing vampiric about the movie at all. It's not a vampire movie. The thing about The Room that really upset me when I was in that rowdy screening, so whenever the character Elisa was on screen, all the audience was being like, "What's wrong with your arms?" and like body shaming her about her arms. It made me want to like it, just to be, antithesis of them. And that was upsetting. Oh, that's an April Fool's Dom Noble did? Nice. Good old Dom. Last time I hung out with him was at Rantasmo's wedding in October? No, May. That was in May. My God, this year has gone quickly. Yeah. It's been a while. Do I know of any vampire Christmas novels? Yes, I do. And I almost put them up for vote. I think I have 3 vampire Christmas novels over on my shelf. 2 of them are not first books in a series, so it might be kind of weird to read. And I was going to be like, let's vote for 3 vampire Christmas novels. But because our month goes from the 13th to the 13th, talking about a vampire Christmas novel on January 13th would be kind of weird. Maybe next year from November 13th to December, that's when we'll do vampire Christmas novels. Though we have read for this book club A Vampire Christmas Carol, which we read in like July or something. People just voted for it even though it wasn't Christmas time. The 2019 Carmilla film was such a missed opportunity. I've heard very terrible things. I have not watched it because I have heard very terrible things. I'm sure I'll see it one day. But, so many vampires, so little time. So the books I did put up, I asked the book club, give me a genre of books to choose from, and then I'll let you vote. And everyone in the book club was like, here's specific books. I'm like, those are not genres. Those are specific books. So one person suggested the mystery genre. I'm like, well, thank you, friend. You're the only one who suggested the genre, so we're going to vote for vampire mystery books, which we did. And the book that won the vote was All These Bodies by Kendari Blake, which surprised me because it is a YA mystery novel, and we had just read this teenager book, so I thought people wouldn't want to do another YA right away, but no, it won. Though by a tight margin. One book hardly got any votes at all, but the other book that got nearly as many votes was Full Moon Rising by Carrie Arthur, which is a romance mystery, nearly an erotica mystery, so it probably would have been the sexiest book we've read so far. And she is a half vampire, half werewolf solving a mystery with a lot of sexy sex. But it got a lot of votes, but didn't win. This one won by a very tight margin. So yes, All These Bodies by Kendari Blake, which is a recent book, and was sent to me by one of you. Came out in 2021. Thank you very much. I love it when you send me vampire books. Have I read any of the Hollows series by Kim Harrison? No. But they are also on my bookshelf, and we will vote for one soon, I'm sure. You have 2 vampire books that you'd like to suggest for my book club read, but I'd like to hear your opinion on them. In order to submit books to the Vampire Book Club for consideration for future reads, I need to own them. So the point of the book club is to read the books I own. I own very many vampire books that I need to read. If you want us to read a book that I don't own, you could send me a copy, find a used copy and send it to me, or, get it to me somehow. Because if I don't own it, I'm not going to go out and buy it for the book club. Because the point of the book club is to read these books I already have. People send me vampire books all the time. That is great. I love receiving them. I do not expect anyone to ever spend money on me. A lot of times people will send me books they're getting rid of on their own shelves. Like, hey, I have these books that I was going to donate. Do you want them? And they'll send them to my P.O. box. Media mail is cheap. Some people just send me brand new books because they are amazing. And they're like, I think you should read this book. And I agree. I have a P.O. box. The address is in the description. Or if for some reason you really want me to read a book but don't have a physical copy, I guess you could send me an ebook. I do a series about all the vampire books I receive at my P.O. box. I wait a few months and collect a bunch, and then I do a series. Do you want to see what's coming up next? Follow me, camera. Follow me. Follow me. Follow. Okay, you see that giant stack of books over by my chair? Those are everything I've received since the last time I did a video about vampire books that I've received. And I'm going to do my next video about vampire books I've received. So look forward to that. Those are the books that people have sent to my P.O. box since my last video. Yeah, if you want to send me books, go ahead. If you don't, no one cares. It's fine. I do not expect anything, but that's the way to do it. So all these bodies a YA mystery novel. The one I had read, the description didn't feel like YA, so it makes me wonder if this is one of those books that was pigeonholed into YA despite being supposedly, more ambiguous than that. 16 bloodless bodies, 2 teenagers, 1 impossible explanation. Summer, 1958. A string of murders plagues the Midwest. The victims are found in their cars and in their homes, even in their beds. The bodies drained, but with no blood anywhere. I guess they mean drained of blood. Who knows what else they could be drained of. September 19th, the Carlson family is slaughtered in their Minnesota farmhouse, and the case gets its first lead. 15-year-old Marie Catherine Hale is found at the scene. She is covered in blood from head to toe, and at first she's mistaken for a survivor, but not a drop of blood is hers. Did they have that kind of forensics in 1958? Michael Jensen, son of the local sheriff, yearns to become a journalist and escape his small town. He never imagined that the biggest story in the country would fall into his lap, or that he would be pulled into the investigation when Marie decides that he is the only one she will confess to. As Marie recounts her version of the story, it falls on Michael to find the truth. What really happened the night that one Carlsons were killed? And how did one girl wind up in the middle of all these bodies? Quiltry Books came out in 2021. So much fear over one little girl. So because it is a teenager telling a story of how she ended up in a murder scene, which presumably involves vampires, as someone sent this to the Vampire Book Club. People send me non-vampire books all the time, but they usually will tell me why they're saying, like, this doesn't have vampires, but I think you like it for this reason. But this didn't say that, so I'm pretty sure it has vampires, or at least is vampire themed. It doesn't have to have real vampires as long as there's vampire themes. That is also a consideration. Oh, you like my reading voice? Thank you. I have done a reading series on my channel. If you want to hear me read to you, I read the summer COVID first hit, and I couldn't think, so I couldn't write scripts. I read vampire stories for people, and I would pause in the story and explain things along the way. I read The Vampire by Paula Dory, I read Carmilla, and I read Dracula's Guest. And those are all on my channel called Vampire Read-Throughs. They're in playlists, so if you want to hear me read you books. It's very sweet that you say that, because all my life people have been making fun of my voice and insulting my voice, and that's kind of like a trigger for me of being told my voice is bad. So thank you, that's very sweet. I mean, if the main character is a teenager, that could make it YA, but YA technically is books that's written for teenagers to read. So the main character could be any age. Often it is a teenager, but could be anything as long as it's written for teenagers. It's for teenage minds to absorb and have an emotional reaction to. And adults love YA too, because of course we can also emotionally react to the same things teenagers react to. Some YA feels childish to us, but some is great. But a lot of times books that are about teenagers will get pigeonholed as YA, even if they're not meant for teenagers, and that's a shame. Any plans to do more vampire read-throughs? I'd love to, because they're so much easier than writing scripts for vampire reviews. I don't have any ideas for stories that would be good for that. They need to be short enough stories. Carmilla's the longest one I've done. It took me 6 videos to get through it, and I wouldn't want to do anything longer than that. So it'd have to be something shorter than that. And something public domain. I'm not going to read Stephen King short stories out loud to you, because it's technically illegal. It's like making an illegal audiobook. Things that are public domain, it would have to be. So it kind of narrows the choices down. Yeah, I mean, I could read non-public domain books illegally to you. It's a thing I could do, but I probably shouldn't. YA has changed a lot over the last few decades. I mean, YA wasn't YA. Before Twilight literally changed the landscape of the publishing industry, there were children's books and there were adult books. And books for teenagers were considered children's books. If you look at the original categorization of the first Twilight book before things changed because of that book, it's classified as children's horror. Is Twilight horrific? No, but because it had vampires, it was classified as children's horror. Now, it would be called young adult paranormal romance, which is a genre that was created entirely because of that book. Obviously, books of that description existed before, but not to such a degree that they needed to create genres for it. Oh, you're so sweet about my voice. Thank you. For public domain, there's Manor and The Parasite, just off the top of my head. Good suggestions, thank you. The Adventures of the Sussex Vampire. I haven't read that one. Wait, is that the Sherlock Holmes one? That's not a real vampire, though, right? But I guess it would work for a read-through. When you were going to elementary school in the 2000s, Twilight was in the scholastic categories? Yes, because, you know, it didn't fit anywhere else at the time. And books that star teenagers are exciting and dramatic. Teenagers are interesting people that will do things that adults wouldn't do because they know better. Teenagers make good, exciting characters in books. And there are plenty of books about teenagers that aren't meant for teenagers, or about children that aren't meant for children. You look at like Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game, right? Nowadays, it would be called a children's book. But it wasn't written that way. It was never intended to be that way. Just because it was about a kid, it wasn't meant for children. It was meant for everybody, right? But if someone wrote that book today and it came out, it would be put there because that's where people think it would make money. It's all about where they think a book will make the most money. How can we market this book to sell the most copies? And you get a lot of books put into places don't really belong as kind of a marketing trick, and you know, it could be not offensive, but like, you know, detrimental to authors. An author would be like, oh, I feel like my book is being degraded by putting into this category where it doesn't really belong. It's a whole thing. Carrie would probably, you're right, Carrie would definitely be YA now. It wasn't at the time. Oh, the Black Vampire. Which are the biggest recommendations for the book club? People want Salem's Lot a lot. People want George R. R. Martin's Fever Dream. A lot of the really big hefty books get asked for a lot, but because those books are so big and hefty, I want to kind of wait for a month where I know I have the time to read it. Christmas is not the month to read a big hefty book. That's why I picked this book, because it's only this long. You know, I'm not going to read like a giant book over Christmas because I am a very busy person. Could Ernessa be a succubus? Sure. What's the difference? You know, energy vampire versus a real vampire. I don't know that she gets her energy specifically from sex. I think the sex was just like an expression of their connection. And she seems to have zero interest in men anyway whatsoever. Do a lot of people request Empire the Vampire? No. I do have it. It was sent to me, and I very much appreciate that. When it was coming out, it got a lot of hype, right? Like, everyone is excited for Empire the Vampire. It is this thick, but I've been told it's a easier read, so even though it's very big, it'd be cool to get through. But after it came out, not that people were disappointed, but the hype died down. So I don't know that it lived up to the expectations. I like that author. I like the other books I've read by him. I know people who know him, so he's like that 2 degrees of separation kind of person. and I'd like to read more of his work. But it's very big. It's right back there on my shelf. I'll try to spin my chair around so you can see it. Stupid chair. Never mind. Oh, there's my stack of books again. Ones I can make a video about. Paul Faval's La Vie de Vampire, Vampire City. Yes, I have it. It's one of those books I've heard about for a long time and wanted and got. Also, The Vampire Countess, whatever the English title is. In French, it was just The Vampire. Because that book was the book the Phantom of the Opera was reading in box 5 while he was watching the operas. And I really wanted to read that. I've been told Vampire City is much better than that book, but I do want to read both of them. And then the third one. But I have them now. They are on my shelf. Someone sent me Vampire City, and then my father for Christmas sent me the other ones. My father sends me a lot of vampire books for Christmas. I've already gotten 4 more from him, and it's not even Christmas Day yet. I am very blessed to have a dad who supports my vampire book obsession. I do think we should read Paul Faval's Vampire City very soon. I might put it up for a vote against a couple other books and let the group decide. The thing about Vampire City is that in English, there's only one way to get it, which is some guy, translated it himself and self-published it on Amazon. And that's the only version you can buy. And it's not cheap. Like, you're paying this guy full price for the work he did. It's not like a mass published thing where they have discounts and stuff. So it's not something that you'll find in a local library. It's probably not something you'll find used. I'm pretty sure there's a Kindle version, but you're probably going to end up paying full price for a print book of this, which does affect the book club readership. When books are more readily available for the book club, people are more likely to read them. But like last month, we all read a graphic novel that was small press published, very expensive, very large, and people bought it and they read it because they were excited about it. And I was very happy with that. It does also exist in a previous form as a free webcomic, so people could have read it that way, but they did actually go out and buy it, which made me happy because you're supporting this, small independent artist author. And that's the point of the Vampire Book Club, is to help support authors. Eric having bad literary taste would be fun. Yes, but he also left the book, which, in French at the time was put in newspaper serialized. He left it in box 5, so he clearly didn't like it that much. He started reading it and then he left it there because he wasn't into it. So I think his literary taste is pretty good. Don't insult the Phantom of the Opera. He is my boy. My dad is not into vampire books himself. He is just very supportive of other people's hyperfixations because, he too has hyperfixations. It runs in the family. They're totally different from mine, but he supports mine. Marine as its Captain Vampire. I'm not sure if that's one I have. It sounds familiar. It might be relevant to the current Ukraine war going on. Interesting. Dracula versus King Arthur. I have not heard of that one. Wouldn't it be cool if I was a vampire? It would look incredible. Yes, it would be cool, and I would look incredible. That would be amazing. One day. Eric is basically a vampire. I mean, ambient sense, of course. Funny story. Once in college, I was in a script writing class because, I was a theater major, so I took a class about writing scripts. Even though I didn't want to be a script writer, I wanted to be an actor. And I didn't know what to write about for my script. So I took one of my Phantom of the Opera fan fictions that I had written years before, and I turned it into a script. And, I changed it so it wasn't Phantom of the Opera anymore. It was just like 2 people who weren't Eric and Christine, but having, phantom-y times together. And we'd had to do a reading of it for the class. So I picked 2 actors in the class, and I had them read the script for the class. And after the class saw my script and were giving me their feedback on it, people were like, so is he supposed to be a vampire? Was he a vampire? Is that what it was? And I was like, no. I mean, originally he was a fan of the opera, but I changed it so he wasn't. But they got that tone immediately that they thought he was supposed to be a vampire. And I'm just like, here's my fan fiction. So there's definitely that vibe there for sure. He sleeps in a coffin. His skull's in his room. If, say, an author like Kim Newman, and would I read a chapter of Anno Dracula together? Together with Kim Newman? I mean, if you wanted to, sure. We read Anno Dracula for Vampire Book Club shortly before Juliet Landau introduced me to Kim Newman personally and was like, hey, you two should talk to each other and he should come on your channel and be interviewed. So I did. So Kim Newman came on my channel and I interviewed him about his vampire books. But because I didn't have a 100% positive review of Anno Dracula, I felt awkward about it. I liked it, but I had some criticisms, right? So I made that video unlisted. So I didn't want him to see it and it to hurt his feelings or to make things awkward. Even if he's like, oh, it was fair, I don't want my criticisms to hurt anyone's feelings. I haven't talked to him since. Like he was lovely. He came on this show and talked to me about vampires and we did our whole interview video together, but I haven't talked to him since. Like, we're not friends. But if for some reason he wanted to do a read through with me, I definitely would. Hopefully we do another one involving manga. Yes, that would be fun. I do have a few vampire mangas. I think, oh yeah, when we read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, the first storyline, I had put it up against 2 other vampire mangas, and the book club voted for JoJo, but those other 2 are still on the table for something that we might read in the future for book club. Definitely, for sure. What are my hyperfixations other than vampires? Beyonce, fitness, and skincare. Oh, fitness and skincare, definitely. I used to work for the Body Shop, a skincare company, but besides just obsessively collecting from there, I also did from every other skincare company. Makeup, obsessively collecting makeup. I have treasure chest troves full of makeup that I never use, never wear, but just obsessively collect. Collecting books, obviously not just vampire books, but all books. This is just one room full of books. Downstairs I have all my non-vampire books in a library. Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, a huge hyperfixation, not just being a fan of it, but writing fan fiction for it. I've posted more words of fan fiction for that fandom on Archive of Our Own than any other person in the history of ever. And what are my other hyperfixations? Fitness, I work out a lot. That's one of them. Counting calories, I don't know. I used to be obsessed with pigs. I used to collect pig figurines. Had hundreds of pig figurines. Beanie Babies, super into Beanie Babies. Phantom of the Opera merchandise, I collected. I had the largest Phantom of the Opera merchandise in the fandom. I had to sell a lot of it when I moved because I was poor and I needed the money. I still have thousands of things, but I sold a lot of the best stuff. David Tennant read aloud Carmilla. That's cool. Good for him. He has a good reading voice. Do I read webcomics? I'd like me to check out Apex Society Undeath, which is far better than Anno Dracula in personal opinion. I have not heard of that one. The only webcomics that I obsessively read is Lore Olympus. I was a hyperfixation for a while, kind of backed off. Now I'm normal about it. I don't really read any other webcomics. There was one called Death in the Maiden years ago that I was super into, but it's kind of gone now. I have a couple of friends who write them and I read theirs to be supportive. But I've heard of that one. I'll check it out. You hope I'm able to interview him again? What would I ask Kim Newman about that I didn't already ask him? I didn't feel like there was much missing from that interview. I'm sure I could talk to him for hours if he was interested. I don't know if he was just being polite or if he actually thought I was cool. I would never presume he thought I was cool. My skin is phenomenal. Oh, thank you. Do I wear sunscreen daily? Yes, I do. I have extremely sensitive skin. Anything I put on my skin makes it rough and scaly. So I've finally found a sunscreen moisturizer that does not, and I'm obsessed with it now. But the problem between having rosacea, because I have Scandinavian heritage, extremely sensitive skin, so anything makes me rough texture, which also caused, acne. So I take antibiotics every day to control that. And Like, I'm allergic to every fragrance and this stuff, so it's been a struggle. Lifelong struggle. New Beyonce album. I love Beyonce, but I'm not obsessed with her. I would have to look at the bottle to remember what I use. Ask me that question in the comments of this video, and later on when I can look at the bottle, I'll come back and I'll answer that question. But put it in the comments of this video so I can actually find it again. You linked Undeath in my Discord DM a long time ago. It's Bloodway. Okay. Well, link it again. Because even if I go back and find it, you want other people to find it too. So link it again so everyone can find it. My skin is very sensitive. I am like a delicate baby flower, which goes against my entire, like, I'm strong, I am buff, I work out. You know, anything can make me, like, sensitive. It's very upsetting. I'm not, like, a strong vampire person. I'm a delicate flower. I will tell you what sunscreen I use if you ask me in the comments, and I can go look at the bottle. Ask. Has anyone read Falling Angel? No. Sounds interesting. Where can I post at in your Discord channel? Everywhere? Do you mean about a specific thing? I mean, if you're not sure, just put it in the general channel. That's always fine. Or if you're in the book club, because we're talking about it in book club, you can put in the book club discussion channel because it's related to this book club discussion. I'm so glad we read a book that was, like, good and we loved, you guys. I mean, I can't there were things about this book that were disturbing or problematic or weird, but there wasn't anything I disliked about it as a book. Like, those things were in there to be disturbing. Just like a solid book. 10 out of 10. Good book. Have I seen the Mayfair Witches series? Yes, I have! I got the screeners of the first 5 episodes of the Mayfair Witches series, and they are unfinished. You can tell they need more editing. So they're not for review purposes. So I cannot comment on them as a review. They're just for me to, like, give me a taste so I can plan my review once I watch the real version. But from what I did see, I'm very impressed, especially compared to Interview with the Vampire, which may have made the bar set kind of low, but the Mayfair Witches series, you should watch. It is very different from the books, but not in a way I minded. A lot of people are upset that the Mayfair Witches series has erased 2 of the main characters and replaced them with a totally different character. He's not like the version of them. He's just new and there instead of them. But I think it worked. And I wasn't that attached to those 2 characters. Like, yeah, I missed them, but the TV show is modernized. It's not set in 1989/1993 because the first book was written in 89, but then the last book was written in 93, and it was retconned to bring everything up to 93 because the 3 books take place over like less than a month time period, even though they were written like many years apart. So retconned up to 1993. It's set in 2022, so that changes stuff. So now all the generations of witches that existed at certain time periods have been bumped up. They did change the family tree. Like, Cortland is now both Carlotta and Antha's sister, instead of Carlotta being Antha's daughter. So now I guess they're all Stella's daughter. They changed the family tree, but I can see why. A lot of the changes they made, I may be like, they changed it, but I can see why. It is very, like, smart TV choice changes. And the pacing of the show is really good. I know I'm not supposed to be reviewing it, but I feel like if I say positive things, that's okay. The pacing is so good. A lot of the pacing was a problem for me in the Interview with the Vampire show, but in the Mayfair Witches show, good pacing. Suspenseful. Tension. Made me want to watch more. It comes out in January 8th, I think. You can see the first episode. It is an AMC Plus exclusive. It is only streaming. You cannot watch it on regular TV. But I cannot wait to see the rest. It's going to have 8 episodes, unlike Interview, which had 7. So I've seen 5, so there's still 3 more to go. And based on where we're at by episode 5, there's still so much more to the story. So I can see there being like many potential seasons to this instead of just like 3 seasons for 3 books. No. I don't even know if they're going to go in the same direction as those 3 books, but the witch family is there, the 13 generations are there. It's good. I hope people aren't mad at me for saying that, because it is very different. I'm not in the Mayfair Witch fandom. Sometimes I dip my toes into like the Facebook groups and stuff for Mayfair Witch fandom, and they're like, these are not my people. I do not belong here. The Mayfair Witch fandom is a much more heteronormative fandom than the Interview with the Vampire fandom, and like my queer people in my queer spaces, I don't really feel welcome there. It is a lot of like middle-aged white straight cishet women, and I'm just like, I don't think you're in here. But I still like the books. I still like, I put them up. You see my shelf here? That's my Anne Rice shelf. This one right here. Can't see it. If I raise my hands, will the camera go up? No. Anyway, I have the Mayfair Witch books on that same shelf with my Interview with the Vampire books. It's the only non-vampire books in this library because they are part of that canon. They fit there. So the thing about the Mayfair Witches books is there's a lot of incest. Incest is an integral part to witches being witches. And I don't know if the show is going to go that route. At least not with the brother and sister incest or the father and daughter incest. It might do cousin and cousin incest. I feel like that's inevitable. There's no way to avoid that. But knowing how purity culture is in fandom spaces today, I don't know how they could do like the full-on incest of those books in a way that would work with current audiences. There's like this huge right-wing conservative thing going on in fandom spaces with purity culture. So we'll see. It's all part of, like, incest is a trope in Southern Gothic novels. It just is. Like, look at Crimson Peak. Like, that's the epitome of Gothic. It's always going to be there. In Edgar Allan Poe, like, everything. No, we don't endorse it, but it is part of the genre. That's what makes it creepy. It's a creepy genre. And I don't think TV should be afraid of creepy stuff for the sake of sanitizing it for modern audiences. Like, creepy is creepy for a reason. Hope the Mayfair Witches series is good. Yeah, nobody was happy about Interview with the Vampire series. No, a lot of people loved it. No one I know. Like, I was fine with the canon changes they made. New time period, new characters, basically entirely new versions of characters, whatever. I didn't care. The problems I had with the show was the writing and the way it contradicted itself. Like, it changed things for TV because it wanted to, sure. But the things that followed up on those changes didn't work with the changes they made. They kept trying to, like, follow the book in ways that didn't make sense to the changes they made, and it just didn't work. It was a very muddled and inconsistent and sloppy show, writing-wise. Good to look at. Not well written. There were scenes that were well written. There were dialogue exchanges that were well written. You could tell when different authors or different script writers were part of it. Parts I liked, but overall. You were hoping there were some lesbian themes in the Mayfair Witches? Mayfair Witches and, like, Anne Rice has never had a lot of lesbian themes. A lot of gay male themes. Bisexual themes, but not a lot of lesbians. In the third book of the Mayfair Witches, Taltos, there's one main character who gets to a point where she's like, oh, I might be bi, actually. She never actually does anything with that info, but she sort of has that revelation. She's very young. She's like 15, so she's still discovering herself. But, no. The witches are very heteronormative. Incestually so, but, yeah. Julian was very bi. The one male character, the one male witch that mattered was very bi, and Anne Rice did write a lot of very queer male characters, but when it came to the women, not so much. Carmilla had slight incest implications, with Laura being a distant relative to the Karnsteins. Yes, vampires in general have incest implications, because the reason Carmilla was attracted to her family members was because that's a vampire trope, because the idea was that after someone in your family dies and goes into the ground and comes back as a vampire, they target the family first. They come back and prey on the family, and then the whole family dies. And this was because if someone died of a disease, the other people in the house would also catch that disease, and that's why they also died. But people thought the vampires came back and targeted their own family. So when the vampires became sexual, in addition to murderous and not just killers, but sexy killers, then it became incestuous, because of that whole targeting the family first trope. And that's what Carmilla did, is she targeted her distant descendants, or she never had kids, so like her distant nieces and nephews, mostly nieces. She was very gay. She never went after men in the books, but all the movies have her go after men. If Lestat didn't wake up in the 80s, would he still try to be a rock star or social media influencer? Well, he would try to be whatever was new and no one had thought of before. So in the 80s, when Lestat woke up and he became a vampire rock star, no one had ever done vampire rock stars before. He was the first person to ever think of it, and that's why it was a big deal. So if he woke up now, he would think of something new that no one has ever thought of, whether it was on like TikTok or whatever platform he used. It would still be entirely new that no one had ever thought of. And that's how he would like change the world, which I can't tell you because I haven't thought of it. So, yeah. You need someone brilliant like Anne Rice to come up with it. Stella was by, yeah, Mary Beth, trans icon. So in the Mayfair TV show, there is a trans actor playing a character that is made up for the TV show. And I don't know if she's playing a trans character or if she's playing a cis female character. Well, let's assume she's playing a trans character, trans actor playing a trans character. That's cool that the TV show added that, put a trans character into the Mayfair family because there wasn't. And there's a point where she is talking about the past generations of the Mayfair witches, and she talks about Mary Beth, who, you know, very butch dyke, liked to wear man's clothes. And she's like, oh yeah, Mary Beth's my favorite ancestor. And I thought that was cool. Let's see, Anne Rice didn't write a lot about women on women, because she said that she identified with men more than with women. She didn't consider herself a woman. She felt she expressed herself better through men, and that's how she personally identified as her gender. So I think she wrote a lot of women, but when it came to their sexuality, it was very heteronormative for the most part. Not always. She did everything. But it was when she wrote about men and was like seeing herself through the identity of a man was when she got to be more adventurous sexually. You know, she never said she was non-binary, but I think that was because she didn't have the language for it. Like when she wrote bisexual, she hyphenated it. Like she wasn't hip with the terms, right? But she did say that she did not identify as a woman. She did not feel that she was a woman, and that she felt more comfortable writing from male perspectives. So I think you can like extrapolate from that. Oh, good night, Karnstein. Thank you so much for joining us. Was Lestat an inspiration for my vampire life? Yes. Yes, he was. Entirely. And the Phantom of the Opera was inspiration for my Grim Reaper of Death. It's all from fandom. I'm a very obvious creature. Ugh. It's 10:16 already. How did that happen? Thank you for joining me talking about the Moth Diaries. I really enjoyed this book. As someone noted in book club in the Discord, there wasn't much conversation about it. Some people had trouble getting a hold of it because it is an older book. It's not available on Kindle. You know, it was a little bit less accessible than some of the books we read. But for those who did read it, I really appreciate your thoughts and insight on it. There was a lot to discuss and a lot of like deep thoughts to have. If you're not in the Discord, the link to join is in the description of this video. You can join the book club. It's a private channel, so you have to like click the button to join the locked channel. But you don't have to read the books. You just join and watch us talk about the books. Anyone is welcome to join the book club. Anyone is welcome to this live stream, even if you don't want to talk about the book. We always talk about other things after the books. It's the only time I live stream, so we make the most of it. And I'm very happy we read this book. And if you want to read along next time, this is our book. You should buy it to support this author, Kendare Blake. She deserves your support. If not, it's new and like available enough that I'm sure your libraries will have it. You'll probably be able to find it on audio and ebook and everything. It's probably not in used bookstores yet because it is still that new. Usually books start hitting used bookstores a few years after they come out. But it is also a shorter book, which is ideal for reading around the holidays. We don't have to read a giant brick of a book over Christmas. And we'll meet again January 13th-ish to read this book. The reason we're meeting tonight on the 14th instead of the 13th is because I was not done with this book yet yesterday. I finished it today. If the 13th falls on a weekend, we always wait until after the weekend. Depends what else I have going on. We always meet at 8:30 Eastern time on this channel on whatever day we actually do end up meeting. You can always ask me anything to do with vampires. If I don't know the answer, I'm just going to say, I don't know. But you can always ask. You just tried to get through the first book of the Mayfair Witches. It's very heavy and long read. I can't say I enjoyed it as much, but I find it interesting, the lack of diversity. The Mayfair Witches book is the first book, The Witching Hours, one of Anne Rice's longest books. It's one of her crowning achievements of books in the amount of work that went into it, and most people consider it one of her best books, one of her like most brilliant genius books she ever wrote. But it is not for everybody because it does not really have a plot. Most of it is flashbacks, backstories to 13 generations of women going from the 1980s all the way back to the 16-somethings and their entire life stories as the characters are learning about the history of this witch family. It is a haunted house ghost story. It's much more about ghosts than it really is about witches. What makes these women witches is the fact that they can see ghosts and commune with ghosts and control ghosts. Most of them don't really have any powers beyond that. The main character, Rowan, does. She's one of the most powerful witches, and that's important for reasons. There's a family ghost that is attached to every single generation of witches. No one knows why, and it's kind of a mystery, and solving that mystery makes it interesting. And some people love it. They think it's brilliant and amazing, and some people are like, oh, it's such a slog. It's so huge. It's a brick of a book. Like, it is literally this thick. It is huge. One of the biggest books she's ever written. Yeah, not for everybody. You could get the audiobook and listen to it on double speed. They're not necromancers. They don't bring the dead back to life, but they can commune with ghosts. Because in Anne Rice verse, ghosts exist, but most people can't see or perceive them in any way. Most people have either completely shut off, they have no sensitivity to ghosts. So people who can see and perceive ghosts are special. Usually they have a heritage of some kind that's passed down to them genetically that lets them do that. Or if they can actually talk to the ghosts, that's another level, especially if they can control the ghost and get the ghost to do their bidding. Or spirits. Spirits and ghosts are two different things. A lot of times something they'll think is a spirit turns out to just be a ghost in the end. But if they can control the spirits and get the spirits to do their bidding, then they're a witch. Then they're super powerful. But it's not them. Like, witches don't have telekinesis, right? They'll get a ghost to lift a thing and move it for them, but they can't, lift it with their own minds. Whereas vampires do have telekinesis. Totally different. But that is her concept of witches. Very not the stereotypical witches. It's cool. And her witch books are completely intertwined with her vampire books. They're same universe, and the stories overlap. Same characters show up in both stories. You're going to read Queen of the Damned? Good. Queen of the Damned is a lot of people's favorite Anne Rice books because when it came out, it invented vampire lore that had never existed before. It was very brilliant and original and came up with vampire concepts that blew people's mind at the time. And a lot of people thought it was amazing. I didn't love it very much because I read it, 10 years after it had come out, and those ideas already seemed kind of cliche by then. And I like more plot driven books, and that's more of like a lore world building driven book, so it wasn't for me, but a lot of people love it. So we always end up talking about Anne Rice every single time. Sometimes I consider pivoting this to a purely Anne Rice channel. People ask me if I'm going to review the Mayfair Witch show on this channel. It's like, this is vampire reviews. We don't review witch shows. I'll talk about it. I will reference it. I will compare it to things, but I'm not going to do witch reviews all of a sudden. You guys, just read in the chat, you guys. I guess it's time we wrap up. I have not read The Light at the End. Should I? Is it a vampire book? I don't even know what that is. Yep, it's 10:22. We usually end by 10. It's been a good long talk. Thank you for joining me for Vampire Book Club. Thank you to Noda Brewing Company, Captain Peanut Butter's Chocolate Revenge. See, it's like a pirate. It's got a skull. Very delicious. Fueling our book club talk. Look forward to, yes, camera, follow me. Look forward to me making a video for you about this giant stack of books. Sorry, it's like a mirror. That I'm going to tell you about next time I make a video. That's going to be fun. Thank you for sending me this giant stack of books. To everyone who sent them to my P.O. box. As well as to my father, who sends me many books because it's Christmas time. Oh, you're welcome for streaming. I love it when you guys talk to me. Thank you for asking me questions. Last month, there weren't a lot of questions like, what am I going to talk to you guys about? You're good. Well, until next time, the link to join book club in the description of this video. You can also join the Discord server just to talk about vampires. It is a themed Discord server. We are focused on vampires or gothic things, spooky things, things that I would like. Basically, we can talk about there, queer things, queer theory, meta, anything gothic or spooky, current events that matter, two things that we care about, feminism, that kind of Discord server. There are about, 600 members, but only about 40 of us ever talk to each other, so it's a pretty chill Discord server, so you don't have to worry about getting overwhelmed. It's nice. And I love all of you who do actually interact with me there. Talk to me. I check the Discord server constantly. I may not always respond, but I am always seeing everything. If you want to send vampire books to the Vampire Book Club for consideration for our reads, P.O. Box address is also in the description of this video. If you want to support the Vampire Book Club, you can join my Patreon. I never charge my patrons for these book club videos, but I do charge them for my regular videos, and that helps support the book club, helps support the Discord server, so it's all connected, and it does help keep this channel running, and I very much appreciate my Patreon patrons, because YouTube does not like me. The algorithm does not like me because I do live streaming videos like this and Let's Plays instead of just hour-long video essays all the time. So that kind of screws the algorithm for me, so Patreon is what makes this possible. Thank you so much. $2 a month makes such a difference. Trust me, it really makes such a difference. If you're going to read all these bodies with me and find out what's up with all these bodies, I look forward to it, and we can talk about it together in the server. Otherwise, I will see you next month, next 13th-ish, January 13th. You know Friday the 13th is a thing because Friday is the 13th day of the week. Well, January is the 13th month of the year. So January, Friday the 13th is the 13th possible day that exists. No, there's no Friday the 13th, it's January. But there is a January 13th, and that will be our special day. 2023. Can you believe it? Thank you. Good night. End stream.